Good morning, Aaron. Good morning, Cleve.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, Cleve, obviously you cover Vice President Kamala Harris for The Post. In just a few words, what has the mood been like inside her campaign as they've processed this defeat on Wednesday?
I don't know if I can say the word dark. One of my good sources reminds me very often that if you are running for president, if you aspire to be president, you are running for president every second of every day of your life, not just in the primaries, not just in the general. If you're working out in the morning, you're working out so you look better on camera.
You're choosing what you eat based on how people are going to judge you, whether you're eating the salad or the hamburger.
It is one of the biggest endeavors that somebody could undertake in their life, and it is something that takes the entirety of you. And so if you're Kamala Harris and you've been in this mode of everything that you do in your life is geared towards becoming president one day, what happens at this point? And I can't from a human perspective, think what that must be like.
Welcome to The Campaign Moment. It's Friday, November 8th. I'm Martine Powers, co-host of Post Reports.
And I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. We're also joined today by White House reporter Cleve Wootson. Hey, Cleve.
Hi, guys.
So it has been just a couple of days now since the election was called for Donald Trump. But there are actually still results that we are waiting on to fill out the picture of who the country voted for. One thing to note, we still don't have a call on Arizona or Nevada, which I just find so funny now because a week ago we were all obsessed with who Arizona and Nevada was going to vote for. And now we've all moved on without even hearing, what actually happened there. Though, to be clear, Trump has a comfortable lead in those two states.
We're also waiting to hear how big Republicans' Senate majority is going to be. Specifically, we're awaiting results in 3 states, in Arizona and Nevada, as mentioned in the presidential race, and also in Pennsylvania, where Senator Bob Casey is seeking re-election and currently trailing Republican Dave McCormick.
And we're waiting on a whole lot of congressional race results. And of course, that's very important because it's going to determine who will have control of the House of Representatives. But Aaron, why is it taking so long to figure out what's going on with the House and with all these House races?
I mean, in a word, California. that's
Come
overly
on, California, get it together.
It's overly simplistic, and it's not just California. There are Western states that handle these elections a lot more through the mail, and that is a process that takes a lot longer. So Arizona, California, and Oregon are going to be the results that really tell the tale of the battle for the House.
And we'll be looking out for that over the next couple of days. And while we wait for those results, we're also waiting to start hearing more about Trump's potential cabinet picks. We do know now that his new chief of staff will be Susie Wiles, who was the co-manager of his campaign, and also notably will be the first female White House chief of staff in history. But as we look forward to the political future of this country, we want to talk today about what this moment means for the Democratic Party.
That's right. And we spent our show Wednesday breaking down some of the initial major takeaways from Donald Trump's huge election comeback win. And you should definitely check out that conversation if you missed it. But now that we've got a lot more numbers, there is a lot more to unpack and a lot of theories about what went so wrong for Kamala Harris's campaign. Also, what this might mean for the Democratic Party moving forward if they need to change some things up. So that's what we're going to be talking about today, and that's why we have Cleve with us.
Yeah, so much of this last week has been just pinballing around the country, and now it just feels like everything is in slow motion as we're trying to figure out what to make of all of this.
All right. So if we're talking today about what went wrong for Democrats in this election, I think that we need to explain for folks the extent of how wrong it went. That Harris didn't just lose the presidential race, but she lost in ways that were very surprising, I think shocking to many people. Aaron, you have been looking at the numbers, and I'm hoping you can just start by laying the land here of some of the top-line stats that really give a picture of how bad this went for the Harris campaign.
I think it's important to note that the shift in the presidential race from 2020 to today was very broad-based. This wasn't a matter of one group or one demographic switching their votes. It was in large part lots of different groups to varying extents. But there are some that we can kind of pinpoint as being among the more significant factors. One of them was Latino voters who went 46% for Donald Trump, according to the exit polls. That was up from 29% in 2016, so a massive shift in that demographic, which is a fast-growing one in America. Another one I'd point to is that abortion rights were just not a major asset for Democrats in the presidential race. People who said that abortion should be mostly legal had favored Democrats by 22 points in 2022 in the midterm elections. This time, it was basically a split, and Harris didn't have much of an advantage on that issue at all if you ask people who they trusted most to handle the issue of abortion. And then lastly, the one that I would point to, which I think is something that caught a lot of people by surprise, was the shifts that we saw in the urban and suburban areas of the country. When Donald Trump has won before, he has done so largely by expanding Republicans' margins in the rural areas, and Democrats won in 2020 by winning back the suburbs and really racking up their margins in the suburban areas. In this election, the more populous an area you looked at, the bigger the shift towards Trump. So he shifted the votes the most in urban areas. He also did really well in suburban areas relative to how he'd done before. And I think that really speaks to how large and broad-based the shifts in this election were towards Trump. He increased his margins in 90% of the counties in this country. So this is something that is kind of a sea of red arrows towards Donald Trump in this election.
Yeah, one example of that I just thought was notable was New York City. Like, Trump did better in New York City in this election than he did in 2016 or 2020.
And I think that gets at why it's so existential for Democrats, because Democrats are the big tent party. But like, Democrats are the ones who have the coalition, and we're sending the message that there's a place for everyone, Republicans, Latino voters, black men, under that big tent. But the one who won by broadening that coalition was Trump.
Yeah, and one thing I'd add, as long as we're pointing to specific areas, if you look at the heavily Latino counties on the U.S.-Mexico border, those saw some of the biggest shifts that we have seen towards Trump. So Starr County, Texas, is the country's most Latino county. It is 96, 97% Hispanic. Donald Trump lost it by 60 points in 2016. He won it by 16 points this time.
And Cleve, I'm curious, like, what has been the reaction from Harris campaign folks or Democrats that you've talked to specifically about these numbers and just the extent of this shift that we saw and how bad this was for them?
If you even look at like who's going to lead the Democratic Party over the next, like, who is the leader after Biden is gone, as Harris rides into the sunset, who's going to lead the Democratic Party and who's going to put up a resistance over the next 4 years? For a lot of the Harris folks, the question is like, what do we do next? And sort of what levers do we have to actually do it?
And I think so much of the answer to that question relies on like a shared sense among Democrats of what actually went wrong here. And I think that shared sense hasn't happened yet. Like, there's a lot of finger pointing and the blame game, and I think a lot of different theories being thrown around about why Harris lost and why Trump was able to make these gains around the country. And so I want to talk through some of those theories and what we've been hearing, at least so far, of what was to blame here for Democrats.
I should warn you, I was state debate champion in North Carolina in my high school years. So
this will be
I'm
good.
in trouble here.
People can't see me cracking my knuckles, but that's what's happening.
Is that right? The statewide champion in debate?
There's different kinds of debate, but yeah, I was one of them.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
That's awesome.
I was waiting to pull that out of my back pocket for years.
I would put that in my Twitter bio. I feel like I should have
cheesesteak
known
still
this
reigns
about you.
supreme.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so now that you're ready to debate all this, let's start with theory number one. And this is the theory that basically this loss for the Harris campaign and for Democrats was because of President Joe Biden, that either he should have dropped out of the race earlier or he should have never run for re-election at all. And basically this comes down to the fact that he didn't leave the race until a few months before this election. Harris didn't have enough time. What do you think about that theory?
A lot of the Harris supporters that I've talked to over the last couple of weeks have said we just wanted more time. Maybe that would not have changed the ultimate result. But when you look at Harris sort of having to realign around the issue of going after black men, there was this big issue a couple of weeks ago, actually, about we have to change how we approach African-American men to get them out to vote. They're not turning out in the same numbers. And I've talked to so many people who say the message is there, the argument that they need to make is there, but there's just not enough time to knock on enough doors to reach enough people and all of that stuff. Most people are in the presidential spotlight for a year or more. As they go to the primary, as their values and their viewpoints are tested. And Harris had 107 days. Would 128 days have made more of a difference, or 136 days have made more of a difference? Do not know.
Or like 450 days.
Yeah. I've been everywhere Harris has been pretty much for the last couple of weeks. And at gigantic campaign rallies, she's still introducing herself to the American people. I was California Attorney General, and as Attorney General, I did this. And while that may sound absurd to the people on this podcast and even many of our listeners, for the average everyday voter who just is not keeping track of everything Harris does every second of her life, that's a big deal. And if they don't know who she is, and she doesn't have the time to kind of tell them who she is and what she stands for, it's hard to think that she'll get their vote if she's just not a known quantity.
And the other thing here is, I think that some people would assume that if there was a primary process, she's probably the candidate who would have emerged from it. She's a sitting vice president. She has these built-in advantages, but you never know. And also, even the process of holding a primary can kind of give a candidate some steel, give them some experience, allow them to work some of these things out. And so it's not even just a matter, I think, of ramping up so quickly with 4 months to go and whether that allowed them to, really get their message out. It's also a matter of maybe they could have worked some of these things out a lot earlier in the process if they had been thinking in terms of her leading the ticket.
Yeah, I would add on to the pile-on just a little bit. A lot of the Kamala Harris staffers still have Joe Biden emails. I think a question can be asked about how hard it is to graft a Kamala Harris campaign onto a Joe Biden campaign and to just completely upend and turn around how you run a race for a white man who has been a part of American politics for 5 decades onto a vastly different candidate who's speaking to a different part of the coalition. Harris brought in a lot of Obama people. Would more time have allowed that to sort of gel and cohere a little bit better and put forth a unified message for Harris? Now, she raised gazillions of dollars.
Well, that's the thing, too, is that you could argue that she ran a very successful campaign in the time that she had because she raised so much money. She performed so well at the debate. I don't know. I think I feel like you could look at how she performed in the time that she had and say, there's not that much to criticize.
She did a lot better in the swing states in which the campaign was actually being run than she did in the rest of the country. If you look at the margin shifts, she lost about 6 or 7 points in the non-swing states. She only lost about 3 points off of Biden's margins in the swing states themselves. So that would suggest that at the very least, the campaign operation was able to turn people out. Her message maybe resonated a little bit better for the voters who are actually being confronted with it more often than in other states. So I think that's a valid point to make in all of this, is that she didn't run a bad campaign. Every campaign could have been better, and maybe the messaging could have been better when it comes to distancing from Biden and things like that. But she was not an unpopular candidate. She did relatively well in these swing states relative to the rest of the country. And it just may be a situation in which this was an environment in which it was going to be very tough for a Democratic presidential candidate to win.
Do you think that with an additional 2 months, an additional 3 months, that it would be a different result then because of that? I know I'm asking you to pay both Monday morning quarterback and Nostradamus at the same time, but this is why you get paid the big bucks.
Yeah, I think that the margin of defeat, getting swept in the swing states, and it looks like she'll lose, the tipping point state will be about a 2-point margin or something like that. The tipping point is the decisive state where if you shift everything in one direction, the result would be different. And that size of loss to me suggests that this wasn't something that could have been cured in a matter of a couple of months more of campaigning or having the right team around her necessarily. I think it suggests it's more of an environmental thing, but you never know what actually could change the results of a campaign. It just seems that it was decisive enough that the prospect of winning by changing something small seems pretty unlikely.
I also do want to push back on the premise that I laid out earlier, this sense that
Push
Harris
back on
did,
yourself. Sure.
Yeah,
Premise,
exactly.
That's fine.
That's a healthy
country
thing to do.
Yeah, exactly. That Harris performed largely quite well in this campaign, and that with the time that she had, she did a pretty good job, or like hit a lot of these benchmarks of success. Cleve, like, in what ways do you think that she didn't perform so well in this campaign, or that she had a bad campaign? What were the moments that weren't good for her and maybe are part of what we saw in the results from this week?
I should start by saying that I do think that her campaign squashed a lot of the doubts that Democrats had about her ability to perform at the highest level. I think there are two things that I would point out that would go into the bad category. I think that early on she played it very, very safe, extremely safe. She didn't do a lot of interviews. It's not just that I think she should be talking to journalists. I think that
I mean, it's really Joe Rogan, right? Like, she should have been on the Joe Rogan podcast.
She should be going, Monday morning quarterbacking. I think she would have done better. Or one of the things they see as a weakness is her ability to reach people that are not us, that are not in that sort of chattering class, already paying super close attention to people that are out working a 9 to 5, picking the kids up from daycare and only tangentially concerned or, interested, invested in this presidential race because they're just doing other stuff. And I think the missed opportunity in not doing interviews and not doing all of that stuff early on in a race that is 107 days is that you don't get to make that up. In the end, you don't have time to course correct. I think the other thing that I would point out that a number of my sources have said, I'm trying to acknowledge their biases in this, but is that there was sort of a taking for granted of the role that Black people, that minorities would play in this role. The campaign apparatus at large kind of, it seems, took for granted that those folks were in the fold. They're there. They're part of the broad-based coalition, and they will be there for us in the end. And I think the campaign realized that with a few weeks to go and put forth, you had Obama out there, you had this agenda for Black men, but in the end, it just was not enough.
And especially because the economy was so top of mind for everyone, right? For white people, for Black people, for Hispanic people, that you saw a widespread sense of, I'm worried about my personal finances. I'm worried about the economy. I don't care if you're telling me that the economy is good. It doesn't feel good to me. And Harris not being able to land that message of, well, what are you actually going to do to fix the economy? And Trump delivering a lot better on that. Yeah,
and I would also argue that if you think about it, her argument was a difficult one to make because a lot of her stuff was about a new path forward, a new way forward, a change in direction and thinking and all of that stuff. But her name is on the administration. She is the establishment for all intents and purposes. And Trump made that argument. And I think that for a lot of the voters that I talked to sort of were just like, well, what is this new way forward if you are the same person that is in the White House? And why aren't you doing these things now?
I agree with Cleve that I don't know if there was a good message for her on this. Some of this is baked in because inflation was very large for much of the Biden administration. And what do you do about that? Do you tell people that, oh, it's not so bad and things are getting better?
It could be worse.
Yeah, it could be worse. That's a difficult thing to do because they might feel that you're ignoring the problem, that you're talking down to them. The alternative is, and it's a very valid argument, that this economic pain was felt worldwide. The United States is far from the only country that was experiencing high inflation. But that's a very difficult message to make to people to understand global macroeconomics. But I do think there is a sense, and I think it's mostly right, that Harris, her economic message didn't penetrate. And I was really struck by a quote from Celinda Lake, who is a well-known Democratic pollster who was talking about this, and this was reported by my colleague Jeff Stein. Her point was that, quote, everybody knows what Trump economics is: China, tariffs, tax cuts. And then you go and ask them, what are democratic economics? And someone will make a joke about welfare, and half the people can't name anything. It's nothing like the Republican brand.
All right, there's so much more to say on this, more theories to unpack. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, I want to dive into the next theory, which I think is on many people's minds, and that is maybe America just hates women, and that's why a woman wasn't elected president this week. So we'll talk about that in a second. We'll be right back. All right, so Aaron and Cleve, we're going to keep talking about some theories of what happened to Harris's campaign, why she lost. But the big one is this about the fact that Harris is a woman, a Black woman? And do we live in a country where Americans just don't want a woman for president, or at least not enough Americans? What do you make of that?
You know, if I was making the debate argument, this would be a very strong data point, which might win me the round. I'm stuck in the past. There's a couple things to that. Every aspect of Harris's vice presidency has in some way been rooted in race and gender, even if the polls don't say it. It is an undercurrent of every single thing that she does, from meeting with world leaders to who she resonates with on the campaign trail, sometimes in a beneficial way when you talk about the coalition, sometimes in a detrimental way when you think about the role of sexism in our society. And I do think that I've talked to other people when I say, what don't you like about Harris? Like, is it a policy, something that she said? It's always these ephemeral things that I think can be obliquely linked to racism and sexism.
Like what?
Her laugh. You know, like, I just don't think she has what it takes, or I just don't think she has it. And then you know,
or she's not qualified.
Yeah, and it's like
senator, or vice president, you know.
And you know, you push back as a journalist, like, what does that qualification look like? Give me an example, and all of that stuff. And when I do that pushback, and people are sort of unable to give me that answer, in the back of my mind, I'm just like, okay, is this the role of implicit bias? Like, is this where race and gender begin to, like, Harris is different than every other vice president that has ever existed. And so, of course, she's, you know, it's going to give people a different feeling. And are they doing the same amount of, you know, checking their own biases and all that stuff? Or do they take those biases into the voting booths in ways that maybe they don't even understand?
A couple points on this. One is that we were talking heading into this election a lot about whether the gender gap would be, you know, historic. Would men turn out for Trump and women turn out for Harris? And some polling suggested that might ultimately be the case. It wasn't really on election day. The gender gap, so the percentage of women who voted for Harris versus the percentage of men who voted for Harris, women only voted for her by 11 points more. And that's very par for course for recent elections, not just 2016 when we also had a woman as the Democratic nominee.
But also in 2020 is what you're saying? Was that?
Yeah, 2020, 2012, 2008, like this gender gap was not exceptional.
Huh.
The difference between how men and women voted in this election was not exceptional at all. And by the way, Harris did not do exceptionally well among women. She won them by 8 points in the exit polls, which is actually the lowest margin for a Democrat since 2004 in 20 years.
Women can be sexist too.
And that's the point that I'm getting to, which is you can't discount the idea that this is an obstacle for both men and women. It's entirely possible. It's a difficult thing to poll because you ask people like, can a woman be president? People are like, yeah, of course they can be, you know, women can be president, but you don't get at those implicit biases that Cleve was talking about. And if it comes down to it and you're looking at these candidates, that perception of can a woman run a country, if that even gives you a little bit of a pause, that's negative for her. And I think the other thing that looms large for me here, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot over the last few days, is that, you know, we're talking about how this election was a huge setback for the Democrats. Democrats actually did pretty well in the race for the House, where they could actually gain seats. They did reasonably well in the race for the Senate. They lost the majority, but that's largely because the map was just very tough for them. They're winning most of the swing state Senate races. They're probably going to win 4 out of 5 of those. So it's not that voters went to the ballot box and issued a wholesale repudiation of the Democratic Party. They voted for a lot of Democrats who were not named Kamala Harris and weren't running for president. And so the question becomes, why is that? Why did she underperform these other Democrats? And I think gender is a valid explanation for that.
Interesting. And then, like, what does that mean for the future, too, right? Does it, like, Are we not going to see Democrats put forth a woman presidential candidate for, like, another 20 years just because people will feel burned by 2016 and
let's hop in the time machine and go to 2019, 2020 when you had the most diverse slate of Democrats. What were there, 6 or 7 women that ran, several Black people, several Hispanics that represented the plurality of the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party ended up nominating a white man. And you got to wonder if in 2028 or 2032, when people are looking at not just who they think would be a good president, but a candidate for president that the other side or the other people in the country will accept, quote unquote, whether they'll say, oh, well, we've got to go with a white man. We've got to go with what is tried and true. And one of the things that we saw very much in 2020 was people, I won't say masking, but their biases were expressed this way. I don't think my brother would do that. I don't think my grandma would vote for a Hispanic man or a woman or whatever. And that became, for me as a reporter,
like the code of, I, of course, would vote for that, but I don't know about my aunt.
I am a very open-minded individual, but you haven't seen Thanksgiving at my house.
Yeah.
That's actually, this is something that pollsters do. Like they'll ask people a question like that and they'll ask them the same question, but, mention the people around you because they feel like it's a truer sense of how big an obstacle this could be.
Yeah, one of my journalism tricks, I'm just going to put it out there for everybody, is just asking people what kind of conversations are you having about this candidate? Like, what are because that frees them from having to say, well, I am biased in this way. It just says the people that I'm talking to in the ether or whatever. And I think there's a reason that this stuff is so difficult to poll for and to suss out in stories is because it makes people uncomfortable to think about themselves and maybe even the people they love in these ways. But those biases go right with them to the voting booth. Now, whether that impacts an election writ large, depends on the election and the time and the candidate and all of that stuff. But I can't believe that it plays no role whatsoever.
Aaron, I want to come back to a point that you made a little earlier about whether or not this election was a larger repudiation of the Democratic Party. Was this, and especially Harris's loss, a reflection of a larger shift away from the Democratic Party or a sense of repudiation of either liberalism, progressivism, like wokeism, if you want to use that term, that like what the Democratic Party is offering and its tone and its culture is like just too off-putting to many Americans? Aaron, you and I had a conversation last week with our colleague Amy Gardner, and I thought it was interesting. She was talking about some of the voters that she'd been speaking to and hearing from, and that many of them were talking about this one anti-Harris ad that was about Harris's support for the trans community, this accusation that she would be providing gender reassignment surgeries for people who are in prison, and this tagline of Kamala is for they, them, President Trump is for you. And that, at least from what Amy was saying, that this was effective for a lot of the people that she had spoken to. I'm curious what you guys think about whether there's like a culture war element to this too, and whether this is a reflection of a wider dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party.
It's possible. I think it's worth noting that to the extent that voters suddenly decided that the Democrats weren't a viable option for them because of culture war issues, they had a pretty funny way of showing it because of the results in the House and the Senate. It was a very close election at the congressional level. So I don't know. I tend to discount the idea that the transgender ad that you mentioned was a big winner. Republicans tried that in 2022, and the narrative after the election was that it was a big failure because Republicans didn't do very well compared to how the opposition party usually does in a midterm election. At the same time, that's a good example of an issue that Kamala Harris was not running on transgender issues. She was not out there talking about they, them and, surgeries and things like that. All of this was from the past. And similarly, Democrats are not running on defund the police, and they're not running, using the term Latinx. But these were features of Republicans' ads. It's like
the sort of caricature of Democrats.
Yeah, the caricature. It's a caricature. It's also something that certain Democrats and members of the liberal movement have advocated at one point or another. Harris did make that comment about gender reassignment surgeries in her past. And it just shows you that, like, these things can have a life even if you're not running on them. And one side can use them and can use them to define you.
I would probably stay away from the word or the phrase culture war, but I do think that there is a significant divide, particularly among folks seeing Republicans increasingly as the party of the non-elites, that Democrats are increasingly Hollywood, Ivy League.
Being the party of Taylor Swift and Beyonce is not necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, is not maybe something that resonates with my dad, who's a dock worker in Philly, So I don't think that it's like clash and war and, they're gonna, your kid's gonna go to school and they're gonna come home having had gender reassignment surgery, as much as it is like the vast swath of just working class Americans able to see themselves when Kamala Harris speaks. And while I kind of agree with Aaron that these individual things may not be flashpoints, I do think that Republicans' ability to caricaturize Democrats as being supportive of they, them, or being supportive of all of these things that are indicative of the elite does sort of slip into the miasma. Like it does sort of just get into there and affect people's thinking in ways that they may not even be conscious about.
So then what does this all mean for the Democratic Party going forward? Especially, as you said, Cleve, this existential question of like, is the Democratic Party still the party of the working class? Which, I mean, I think at this point, the answer is a clear no. What do they do? How do they fix that?
A couple of things. One, I think there is just soul searching about who is going to lead the Democratic Party? Who is the person or people that are seen as plotting a path forward? And I think
Michelle Obama, clearly.
Yeah.
The only Democrat that everybody likes.
Yeah, I think about it this way. Who is a Republican's most effective messenger? It is clearly and without a doubt Donald Trump, the person that is running for candidate and for president and who successfully ran for president and who leads the party. Who is the Democrats' most gifted messenger? It wasn't Joe Biden. It wasn't Kamala Harris. Pete Buttigieg went on at the DNC and said, "Hi, I'm Pete Buttigieg. You may recognize me from Fox News." Gavin Newsom is exceedingly eloquent. And I am not a person who subscribes to simple, easy solutions. But could having a better messenger who is able to espouse democratic policies in a way that a wider stretch of Americans can understand them and how they will benefit them be one of the solutions that they're looking for? I'm not sure.
That's a good question. There's so much more that we could be talking about right now, but we have run out of time. Mm-hmm. Cleve, thank you so much for being with us here today.
I'm glad to be here as always.
Cleve Wootson is a White House reporter for The Post. A couple words before we wrap up today's show about what to expect going forward. Even though we are now through the election, Aaron, congratulations on getting to this point.
We made it.
We're still going to be publishing episodes of The Campaign Moment until Inauguration Day on January 20th. So we'll be covering all the important news as the Trump administration takes shape, prepares to assume power once again. If you're tuning in via Post Reports, that means you can expect to keep hearing these episodes most Fridays. We'll also continue publishing extra episodes in the Campaign Moment show feed itself. So be sure to look that up wherever you're listening.
That's right. And I'll also, of course, be continuing to cover the transition of power and the post-election results and things like that in my newsletter, The Campaign Moment. So make sure that you're subscribing to that.
So, Aaron, you're not off the hook yet.
Not yet. No rest for the weary.
And you can find the link to the Campaign Moment newsletter in our show notes and at postreports.com.
Today's episode was produced and mixed by Ted Muldoon. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Mary Jo Murphy.
Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Monica Campbell, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Spernovsky, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Laura Benshoff, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, and Elahe Azadi. I'm Martine Powers.
And I'm Aaron Blake.
I'll see you next week.
See you soon. It's all coming together with the debate champion thing.
My wife makes fun of me because I still have the trophies.
No, you can't. No.
And when
Let
you're
me
like,
talk to
I hope
her.
they're in a display case
not all of
with
them.
a light,
Some
a
of
spotlight on them.
All of them. There's multiple ones.
There was a lot.